All right. Hi, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Talk Data to Me with Lookout, where we talk about all things data security. Today, I'm excited to have Aaron Cockerill, our Chief Strategy Officer, joining us on the show. Aaron, always nice to have you on.
Hi, how's it going? Good to be here.
Always great. So today we're going to dive into kind of one of the most critical pieces, really missing pieces in many organizations' data protection strategy, which is the mobile device, iOS, Android, even some Chrome OS devices,
Yep.
and how that ties into cloud security initiatives. Because as people are migrating to the cloud, as data becomes more broadly accessible from more devices, we really need to think about how things like personal smartphones, tablets, or corporate issued ones, managed, unmanaged. There are so many different ways that these devices can be used and presented to employees. And think about how it's just as likely that you could be using that device as you are your company laptop these days. So for that reason, excuse me, we're kind of seeing attackers make this shift and target employees on those mobile devices to really have the means to gain initial access to your data, whether that's through something like mobile phishing or exploiting vulnerabilities. So as we're seeing growth in this mobile vector, and seeing more sophisticated attacks, those are really targeting those mobile users, and methods like social engineering, phishing attacks. They're not necessarily new, but they're becoming much better, especially with the use of things like generative AI. And in addition, attackers are finding a way to bypass some of the more traditional security measures like multi-factor authentication, or finding ways to just swipe those tokens altogether. So, Aaron, I'm going to hand it over to you. Kind of take the audience through your perspective on all this. I've been you know pontificating here for a little while, so I'll let you take over for a little bit.
Yeah, no problem. So I think the first thing that we have to recognize is as everyone moved to the cloud, the nature of attacks has changed. I guess the easiest way to think of it is if you had a Windows server in your local data center or a smaller business in your broom closet or whatever, and you were responsible for patching that, and so attackers were able to exploit the fact that you hadn't gotten around to it. That doesn't happen as much when you use SaaS applications and when you use infrastructure as a service in the cloud. Or it can still happen, but it happens less. So from an attacker's perspective, the ROI is higher if I instead try and gain access to the data that is in those cloud repositories through other means, typically through impersonation or essentially getting hold of the credentials for an individual. So what we're seeing is a change from attacks that would exploit bugs, vulnerabilities, to attacks that exploit things like either misconfiguration, as in configuring the SaaS environment incorrectly or whatever, or literally the theft of credentials or use of stolen credentials to gain access to data. The reason that mobile is so important for the attacker in that scenario is attackers will go after they're looking to steal data. That's how they get leverage over the organization to extort them financially.
Mhm.
So how do you target a specific user from credential theft perspective if in order to gain access to that data? It's through their mobile device. You could potentially purchase credentials from the dark web, and we're working on solutions for that type of thing as well. But the sort of the highest return on investment at the moment we're seeing from an attacker perspective is literally to trick the right people into giving away their credentials. And we saw that start with Lapsus. They definitely targeted mobile devices from a social engineering perspective in order to get access to credentials to then steal data and extort users. But we're seeing some very interesting and very targeted attacks more recently in this vein.
Mhm. And with Lapsus, maybe could you just give the viewers a quick overview of kind of their tactics?
Yeah, essentially, so I'll talk about Lapsus, but also Octopus, which is a more recent one, and they're both very similar. Essentially, what was done was the bad actors identified individuals that had access to large data stores and then targeted them from a mobile oriented social engineering perspective to trick them into giving access to that data sets, typically through the theft of their credentials. Then with those credentials in hand, especially most recently, the way that it happened with Octopus and is still continuing to happen with Octopus. By the way, Octopus is also named, I think it's Scattered Spider.
Scattered Spider, yeah.
CrowdStrike. It's got a couple of different names, no attribution yet. But what they're doing is they find individuals that have access to large data sets, steal those credentials, and I think that's happened in like over 169 domains so far. They've gotten something like 10,000 sets of credentials and so on. It's frightening, the progress that they've made. It's all been published on a Telegraph site. But the point being, once they get those credentials, then they steal the data through what appears to be legitimate access. Like, it's impersonation, but it appears to be legitimate access. So monitoring for malware, for example, in your environment is simply not going to catch it. They download that data and then, extort you based on either we're going to sell that data or we're going to expose it, and so on.
Right. And so, I think for the folks watching, we've mentioned social engineering, mobile phishing, things like that a couple of times here. So I think it's just really understanding. I think what Aaron just went through helps people understand why that, it's not like it's not that threat actors are necessarily going to gain access into your organization through a mobile device.
That's right.
But it's the fact that it's a leverageable, exploitable starting point for these attacks. And especially as we think about things like mobile phishing, social engineering, these are these can be more prevalent on BYOD, or bring your own device deployments. In fact, in last year in 2022, using Lookout data, we saw, it's a stat here, over half of personal devices were exposed to at least one mobile phishing attack every quarter. So for a year, and that's not insignificant, right? If you're a 10,000 person organization and you let people use BYOD, 5,000 people getting exposed to 4 phishing attacks every quarter, that's 20,000 phishing attacks a year that you have to make sure you can protect those credentials against.
And I think I want to make sure that the audience understand why that's happening as well, because it's not like the social engineering attacks are being directed, say, at the work laptop. It's like we do get phishing still, obviously, in corporate email and all that sort of thing, but there's two differences on a mobile device. The first one is that there are a plethora of different platforms that you can use to send messages to an individual. Obviously all the social networking tools, as well as SMS and even phone calls. But it's that second part of what I just said that's really important for the audience to recognize. You can target the attack at an individual when it's a mobile device. It's very different than the types of attacks that we would get blasted across a corporate email. This is a targeted attack at an individual that the attacker knows has access to large data sets. So if they know the only way to really direct that attack is to go after the mobile device, because that's what identifies us in this digital world these days.
Right. That's a really interesting, actually, perspective of thinking about it in terms of how it's shifted. And one other thing that's changed a lot recently, and we went pretty deep in on this on our last episode, but what's your take, Aaron, in a strategy role, looking at this at a pretty industry-wide level, on kind of the future of machine learning, artificial intelligence, generative AI, all of that, and how that sort of is going to play a role in security and data protection?
Well, I'm going to talk both about the protection and the threats.
Right.
One of the most obvious, you mentioned at the beginning, but I want to make sure that people understand what you're talking about. From a bad actor's perspective, generative AI is enormous enormously beneficial. I'm not pointing fingers at any particular country right now, but many of the attacks that we've seen in the past, we've been able to identify them, especially in the US and other English-speaking countries, because frequently the attacks originate from non-English-speaking countries, and the messages are poorly worded. So it was relatively, bad syntax, bad spelling, bad punctuation, whatever it is. It was sort of easy to, well, that's not a message from my CEO because I know he can spell and he can speak English well. So when an attacker has access to something like generative AI, they can very, very quickly craft very compelling and realistic looking messages from a social engineering perspective. And there are many other uses for generative AI in general when it comes to the attacker. We should probably talk about that separately, Hank. But just the crafting of the message effectively is a huge step up for the attacker. So we have at Lookout, what we're experimenting with is leveraging essentially the reverse of that, being able to identify messages that are crafted by generative AI. Excuse me. We'll also use artificial intelligence and machine learning to do things like hunt for phishing kits and phishing attacks in general. And we've been able to identify ahead of most of the people in the industry specific phishing sites coming up. They're usually only alive for sort of 24, 48 hours. So you've got to be pretty quick to catch them. And we have a proven track record of doing that using machine learning to analyze websites and hunt for these kits. So we're working on in that particular area. The other area that we're working, which shows great promise, is being able to identify data that is sensitive using generative AI. But that's probably a topic for another discussion, Hank.
Yeah, we can take another session or three on going through all the kind of different branches there. But so we're starting to come up on time here, Aaron. So one last thing for you, but you just started to mention, being able to identify data, looking at things from that sort of data-centric approach. So when it comes to when you're talking to security teams about their strategy, why is it so important to really look at data in the center of that strategy when it comes to protecting not just the data itself, but the users, their devices, and then maybe a couple things people can start doing to start addressing some of these challenges?
I think one of the most interesting conversations that you should have within your organization is, why is cybersecurity and data security separate? The attackers are going after data. That's what they use to extort you. So, and cybersecurity tends to focus, or has focused in the past, on malicious processes executing on servers, or passwords not RDP being used on devices that it shouldn't be, and we focused on malicious behavior and malicious code, when I believe that what we should be looking more closely at is whether data, when it moves, is good or bad. And so at Lookout, what we're very focused on is leveraging the endpoints instead of monitoring for, we do monitor for malware, obviously, on the endpoints and so on, but instead of monitoring for malware on the endpoints as the origin of attack, we look much more at coordinated phishing and social engineering as an indicator, a precursor of the likelihood of attack. And then we monitor for anomalous data movement, but data moving being good or bad, as evidence of that attack, detection of an actual breach. And then response needs to be around closing down access to that data, taking that data source offline, or at least disabling it for that particular user or that particular entity. So I think we need to think more about cybersecurity being about data security instead of being about malware and detection of malicious activity, unless it obviously relates to the movement of data, which is where I think we need to focus.
Yeah, I think looking at it from that approach is really helpful and almost makes it a little more consumable too, because this is kind of an ever changing target that you have when your CISO comes to you and says, "Hey, we need to change this thing or adjust this thing or do whatever it may be." So
data security has been seen as, well, these guys write DLP policies over here, and these guys monitor for threats over here. That needs to come together.
Totally agreed. All right, folks. Well, that's all the time we have here today. Aaron, thank you as always for joining us, and thank you to the audience for tuning in. We do have actually an on-demand webinar linked that if you want to hear Aaron go more in depth on a lot of what we talked about today, you can check that out. And until our next episode of Talk Data to Me, we'll see you soon. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.